Often asked that what constitutes a thesis or what really constitutes research. I said, look, the first question that I would ask, and I'm a reviewer of, an editorial reviewer of for several journals, and I'm sent things to review all the time. When I look at something, I said, the first question I ask myself is, what is new and or different about this piece of work? And why I say that is that research is ultimately about an addition to existing knowledge. You don't want to do what I call a Me Too project. Because something has been done in 20 other places, now you say, I want to see whether it's true in Sylhet or whether it's true in Borishal. That's not research. Unless there is a reason for you to think that there's something particular about Borishal which makes it different. And I said, that's the whole point about being, it has to be something that adds to our understanding of the topic. So the first thing I tell people is think a little bit about how you're going to frame your research question. You know, it may be a question that other people have looked at, but unless you can make the case that examining it in the context that you are examining it is going to add something to our understanding of it, it's probably not worth doing. And frankly speaking, a good journal will not publish it. The first thing that a good journal will look at is it adding something to the field? And you know, this is not something that requires statistics or any kind of quantitative models or any kind of abstract. You have to basically really think hard about what am I adding? To answer that, you have to know what's been done. So I always say that, look, research is hard work. You start off with an idea, and that's where it always has to start. But then you have to do a lot of looking into what do we know about this? What do we know and what don't we know? And your contribution is in that area of what we don't know. And as I said, it doesn't have to be something blindingly new. It can be that in these conditions we expect things to be different, and maybe they are and maybe they're not. And that's a test of a hypothesis that other people have looked at. You know, a lot of what I've said is somewhat abstract, and probably half of you are asleep, but the other half are wishing that you were. That's the way it goes. So I want to sort of, bring it from the abstract to the personal and tell you a little bit about my research story or my story as a researcher. Not because I do think that mine is not an atypical story, but I think perhaps you'll take away something from that and it will spark an interest. One of the things that I take pride in, and it's as my daughters, who are always my biggest critics, say that maybe it's not something you should be so proud of. I told them that, I've never done anything that I was formally trained for. And by which I mean that I've followed what I was interested in, and I've not been bound by a particular disciplinary background. If I've been interested in a question, I've tried to see whether I can explore it. Now, of course, if you're trained as a physicist, and it's actually interesting that you could research poetry, but going the other way around would probably be more difficult. If you're trained as a poet, it would probably be not such a great idea to start doing research in fundamental physics. But having said that, I think there's a lot, and the reason why I'm interested in this topic is I think the best research is cross-disciplinary, is interdisciplinary, is what they say thinking laterally. Some of the best biologists are people who started off as physicists. Some of the best physicists are people who came from a very different tradition and started thinking about it. So I actually celebrate this idea of bringing in people laterally. And one of the things that I think I really am very appreciative of the American higher education system, that unlike the European and the Bangladeshi system, you're not locked into what you started to do when you were 16 or 18 or 20. I have lots of friends who have moved laterally. I myself have changed careers several times. I started off as a biochemist, then I went to medical school, then I gave it all up because I was bored with it. I wanted to be a social scientist. I studied economics and sociology. I did work on kinship networks, very far afield from my initial training. Then did that for a while, and then I moved again, became a psychiatrist. And I think I was very lucky that I was in a system which allowed me this freedom to move laterally. And the best research comes from this lateral thinking. Just to give you a brief arc of my research career, the first time I ever did research was when I was a junior at Harvard College, and we had, as part of my thesis requirement, I was a biochemistry major, and I had to work on something called transfer RNA. Don't ask me what it is. I myself barely remember what it is. At some point, I did know what it was. In fact, the only thing I remember about that summer working at Harvard Medical School with a very well-known researcher was that I read a wonderful book which I really liked. It was called The French Lieutenant's Woman by John Fowles. It had nothing to do with biochemistry, but it's one of the most interesting books I've ever read. And perhaps the only interesting thing I got out of that summer was that it evoked my interest in reading. By the way, a good movie on that as well. So if you don't catch the book, watch the film. I remember I got completely negative results, but I ended up getting a very decent grade because I managed to convince my supervisor that there were lots of reasons why the negative results came out. And he made a very interesting comment that he said that, I've given you a good grade because you've spent a lot of time and a lot of thought about trying to explain to me why your experiments didn't work. He said, in the real world, that doesn't always work, but that's actually a lot of research is about trying to make sense of what you have, not what you wanted to get, because research doesn't always go in the way that you want it. And as I said, you should never, one of my favorite quotes is, never waste a crisis. A crisis is when you got something which is totally opposite of what you thought. And you can either throw up your hands and say, look, this is all, I messed up. A good researcher doesn't do that. A good researcher, reinvents himself or herself and says, maybe there's a story in that. So that was my first foray in what I would call sort of serious research. I decided I wasn't cut out for biochemistry. I liked literature perhaps much more than I liked working in the lab, and I decided the last refuge of people who don't like biochemistry research is I went to medical school and enjoyed that. And when I was a medical resident, I had another very interesting experience. Actually, it was in Bangladesh. I came to spend a summer, and I ended up working on 2 papers on hypoglycemia and diarrhea. Very, very mainstream medical research topics. The interesting piece of the story is not what I worked on, is that when I look back, I was blessed. I had a mentor. His name was Dr. Michael Benish, kind of a crazy guy. I came in. He said to me, oh, you're here, but I'm leaving tomorrow for a month. So I said, what am I going to do? I'm here for 3 months, you're gone for a month, you're my supervisor. He says, you know what? This is, we've been thinking about this whole hypoglycemia thing. I don't know very much about it. I'll come back in a month. I want a research proposal. Tell me what you want to do, how you want to do it. And I said, are you crazy? I have no idea what you're talking about. And he said, I'll see you in a month. And he went off, and I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. But since I was here and I had to give a report at the end of 3 months, I said I better start working on it. Anyway, it ended up that I ended up, doing a lot of work and trying to understand this topic, which I knew relatively little about when I started. And it ended up being a very, very fruitful experience, because 2 highly cited papers, one in the New England Journal of Medicine. In fact, ironically, 2 of my most cited papers are in fields that I have not worked in 25 years. When you look at your research history, I always find it amusing that your early papers sometimes are cited much more than the ones, not only because they happened earlier, but so that was very conventional, clinical, somewhat lab-oriented research, very much in the mainstream of my medical career. But as I said, I've never been shy about moving on. I moved on from clinical medicine, and I decided that I was interested in doing something in the social sciences, and I got into the PhD program at Harvard and environmental epidemiology. There is a story here. I'm not saying it. And because I needed the funding, I accepted it. That was the only grant going. And I had no interest in environmental epidemiology. I had very little knowledge of what environmental epidemiology was, but that was the grant, and I took it. And I ended up working on a topic which I must say that I give myself a little bit of credit in convincing people that it fell under this rubric. I worked on something called marriage and mortality. Now, it was not that easy to convince my thesis chair, who also happened to be the chair of the department, that it fell under the rubric of environmental epidemiology. So he said, how am I going to sell this? I have to endorse your topic. I said, well, if it's not genetic, it's environmental. So since marriage is obviously only, we are making a case that it's not genetic, therefore, and he thought a lot about it. He said, that's a very, that's a pretty insightful comment. I'm endorsing it, but I hope for your sake, young man, that they buy it. Fortunately, they did. And I did finish my PhD. And one of my most memorable papers, not because I think it's particularly interesting, but I think the title is interesting. There were two papers, and I spent a lot of time thinking about the title. I don't know why. I mean, and I will tell you that when you send a paper, it is actually well worth trying to get a catchy title, because it does actually attract people's attention. So one paper was called Family Matters. And it's a pun on the word that family is important, and also that it's about family. And people, by the way, my literary tastes are, there's a very wonderful book by Rohinton Mistry called Family Matters, which came out much later than my thesis. And in fact, I briefly thought whether I should talk to him about copyright violation. And in fact, interestingly enough, the book is in a literary form a very, very interesting recapitulation of the kind of work that I was working on in a much more dry, statistical things, that family does matter, and many things about families matter. Particularly, we were looking at marriage. The other paper that I wrote, again, was called, and this was a bit of a controversial topic, it was called Marry Early and Often, but Only If You're a Man. And it has to do with this notion of gender selectivity, and that the ability to get married several times is a marker for your essential health and survival. And marriage, by the way, the whole topic of the thesis was about the benefits of marriage. And the benefits of marriage are all accrue to men. For women, if you are economically independent, there are no additional survival benefits. There are obviously, I don't want to make a position on marriage, but there are no at least economic benefits, no additional survival benefits for women. But for men, what is the most surprising thing is that, surprising only because people don't understand it. It's a phenomena that people have known for hundreds of years, that married people live longer. It's not clear why. And one of the often espoused theories was that for men, it's because women brought their spouses, their wives brought social contacts and their social network. So that when men get divorced or widowed, they lose that and they end up doing badly and end up dying. Now, this is another case of where I started off with a very completely different hypothesis. I was interested in this hypothesis. It had been looked at in the Western world. I came up with this idea that rural Bangladesh is a very patriarchal society where the kinship networks are all driven by men, because women, there's something called village exogamy, where women marry outside their village. So women don't bring in any new social contacts. So the idea was that this would be a test case where actually I was hoping to find that marriage did not confer any advantage to men. And, my supervisor thought it was a great idea and that, it made sense and theoretically it was plausible. And we collected data from Matlab where we looked at marriage and survival. And much to my utter horror and chagrin, found that even in rural Bangladesh, very patriarchal society where men call all the shots, married men lived significantly more than men who were not married or never married, and women who you would expect the opposite, that because of their relatively disadvantaged position, that married women in rural Bangladesh would do much better, in fact didn't do